The night Nia Carter saved a little girl's life inside Riverside General Hospital, she was fired by morning. No hearing, no mercy, just a security escort and a parking lot. But what the hospital didn't know, what nobody knew, was that a very powerful man had been watching the whole time. And he hadn't seen enough yet. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The Riverside General Emergency Room never truly slept. Even at 2 in the morning, the fluorescent lights buzzed without mercy. Nurses moved in tight, purposeful patterns between curtain bays, and the smell of antiseptic clung to every surface like a second coat of paint. On most nights, the rhythm was predictable, frantic in bursts, then eerily still. But on this particular Tuesday evening, the ER had a different kind of energy running through it, something tighter, something loaded. Nia Carter had been on her feet for 11 hours straight. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the linoleum as she moved from bay to bay, clipboard tucked under her arm, the small gold cross at her throat catching the overhead light every time she turned. At 32, Nia had the kind of face that put people at ease. Warm brown eyes, a quiet mouth that always seemed on the edge of a reassuring smile, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had come up the hard way. Community college nursing program, night shifts through her 20s, student loans that still sent her stomach tight every time she opened her bank app. She had worked a hospital cafeteria during her first year of nursing school just to keep the lights on, and she still remembered the humiliation of a declined card at a gas station at 2 in the morning after a double shift. Those memories didn't make her bitter. They made her precise. Riverside General wasn't a dream job. It was the job she had fought for and earned. And she wore that pride carefully, the way you wear something you know can be taken. Tonight's chaos had been building since a multi-vehicle accident on the highway brought in a wave of patients just after 9. By the time that rush began to settle, 2 new admissions had come through the main doors. And that was when the atmosphere shifted in a way Nia recognized before she fully understood it. She was resetting a saline drip in Bay 4 when she heard it. Not a shout, but the kind of low, urgent murmuring that travels faster than any announcement. Staff straightening up. A nurse at the central station smoothing her scrubs unnecessarily. The particular hush that fell when hospital administration walked the floor. Dr. Richard Hale came through the ER doors like a man who expected the room to acknowledge him, and the room obliged. He was 56 years old, silver-haired, built with the comfortable solidity of someone who had eaten well his whole life. His white coat was pressed to a crease that seemed almost aggressive given the hour, and his expression carried that practiced neutrality that administrators wore when they were deciding something they didn't want to explain. Behind him, 2 senior physicians moved quickly to match his pace. Heads bent toward him in that posture Nia had always privately called the lean, the one that meant they were receiving instructions, not having a conversation. She watched from the corner of her eye and kept moving. The second admission that had changed the room's energy was in Bay 9, a man named Warren Aldridge, 61 years old, chest tightness, borderline BP. The attending had already been with him twice. Nia knew the name because she knew most names on this floor by the end of a shift, but she also knew it because 2 staff members had whispered it near the supply closet with a tone that told her he was someone. A donor, probably. The hospital had a donor wall in the main lobby, brass plaques and framed photographs, and the people on that wall received a particular quality of attention that the others didn't. She didn't begrudge it exactly, she just noted it. What she didn't expect was the stretcher that came through the ambulance bay at the same moment Hale was making his way toward Bay 9. The paramedics were moving fast, faster than the controlled urgency they usually maintained, which meant something had changed in the rig on the way over. On the stretcher was a child, small, pale, maybe 7 or 8 years old, her dark hair damp against her forehead and her eyes closed in the loose way that wasn't sleep. An oxygen mask covered most of her face. One of the paramedics was calling out vitals in clipped, rapid bursts. Heart rate elevated, blood pressure dropping, LOC for approximately 9 minutes. Nia was already moving toward them before she had consciously decided to. The attending who intercepted the stretcher was Dr. Marcus Cole, mid-30s, competent, generally good under pressure. He took the handoff chart from the paramedic and scanned it quickly, and Nia moved to the opposite side of the stretcher, beginning to assess with her hands and eyes simultaneously the way years of floor work had made automatic. The girl's name was Emily. That was all the paramedics had. No last name on file, found by a passerby outside a restaurant 3 blocks over, no guardian on scene. Nia pulled the penlight from her pocket and checked pupils. Equal, sluggish reaction. Skin cool to the touch despite the warm night. She glanced at the monitor a tech was connecting and watched the numbers settle into a pattern she didn't like. Bay 2, Dr. Cole said, already moving. Let's get a full panel CT head ATOC screen. Her pressure's at 84/50, Nia said, keeping her voice level. I see it. Let's get her settled, and we'll reassess. They moved Emily into Bay 2, and Nia stayed close, watching the girl's face, watching the small chest rise and fall with the shallow rhythm that made something in her stomach go quiet and alert at the same time. She had learned to trust that feeling. It was the feeling that meant pay attention. She was connecting the cardiac leads when she heard Dr. Hale's voice from the corridor. Dr. Cole. Not a question. A summons. Cole stepped out. The conversation was brief. 30 seconds, maybe less. And when Cole came back in, his face had the specific neutrality of someone receiving an instruction they weren't going to argue with. Aldridge in Bay 9 needs coverage, he said, not quite meeting Nia's eyes. Hale wants senior staff on him through the night. What about Emily? Nia asked. She's stable enough for now. Vitals are holding. We'll monitor and get the tests back. Nia looked at the monitor. 82/48 now. Her pressure's dropping, she said. I'll check back in 15. He was already turning. Page me if anything changes significantly. She stood in Bay 2 alone with the child and the beeping monitor and the particular quiet that follows when someone leaves a room they should have stayed in. The next 20 minutes moved in a way that Nia would later struggle to describe, not slow, not fast, but with a clarity that made every detail sharp-edged and permanent. She took Emily's temperature, slightly below normal, which was wrong given the elevated heart rate. She reviewed the paramedic notes again, reading between the lines the way experience taught you to. The passerby who called 911 had mentioned the child seemed confused before she went unresponsive. Not panicked, not in pain, confused. Nia pulled up the standard differential in her head for a child presenting this way. Hypoglycemia, cardiac event, toxin, neurological. She checked the glucose reading on the initial panel. Normal. Checked the tox screen status. Still pending. She checked Emily's pupils again. Still sluggish, still unequal in a way that was subtle but present, left slightly larger than right. That wasn't hypoglycemia. She stepped to the doorway and looked toward Bay 9, where 3 staff members were clustered around Warren Aldridge with the focused attention of people who had been told, without being told, that this patient mattered more than the others. Back at the monitor, Emily's pressure had dropped to 79/44. Nia picked up the phone at the base station and paged Dr. Cole. She waited 90 seconds. No response. She paged again and began pulling the crash cart closer to Bay 2 with her free hand, not because she was using it yet, but because she wanted it within reach. She was rechecking the cardiac monitor when Dr. Hale appeared in the doorway of Bay 2. He looked at her, then at Emily, then back at her, with an expression that was not unkind, so much as completely indifferent. Why is this card out here? Her pressure is dropping, Nia said. I've been trying to reach Dr. Cole. Cole is with Aldridge. That situation requires his attention right now. With respect, Dr. Hale. Well, this child's vitals are trending in the wrong direction, and her neuropresentation doesn't match. Her initial assessment shows no acute emergency. He said it with the calm of someone who had made a decision before walking into the room and was now simply narrating it. She's being monitored. Stay focused on your assigned patients. Sir, her pupils are unequal. That could indicate Nurse Carter. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Mr. Aldridge is a critical patient who requires our full resources tonight. This child will receive appropriate care in appropriate order. That is how we manage this floor." He left. The sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor with the unhurried rhythm of a man who expected no challenges. Nia stood in the bay with her hands very still at her sides and looked at Emily's face. Small, pale, eyelids slightly fluttering now in a way they hadn't been before. The girl's breathing had changed in the last few minutes. Still present, still functional, but with a slight irregularity at the top of each exhale that Nia's ear had been trained over years to notice. She looked at the monitor. 76/41. She thought about her license. She thought about the mortgage her sister was fighting to keep. She thought about the hearing she'd had 2 years ago over a documentation dispute that had taken 6 months to clear up, and how close it had come to derailing everything she'd worked for. Then she looked at Emily's face again. The child's lips were taking on the faintest blue-gray tinge at the edges, so faint that you would miss it if you weren't looking for it. Nia was looking for it. She pressed the emergency response button on the wall of Bay 2 and stepped fully into the room. "I need a team in Bay 2, she said into the overhead, her voice carrying the specific calm of someone who has decided. "Pediatric emergency, right now." What followed was not graceful. Emergency medicine rarely was. The team that responded came quickly. 2 nurses, a resident, a tech, and Nia moved among them with the efficiency of someone who had run codes before, who knew which directions to give and how to give them, who understood that in the absence of a physician lead, someone had to be the lead. She had already formed a working hypothesis. The presentation, dropping pressure, altered consciousness, unequal pupils, below normal temperature with elevated heart rate, pointed toward a specific and serious intracranial complication. A herniation risk, the kind of thing that looked like nothing until it looked like everything. "She needs imaging now," Nia said, keeping pressure on Emily's IV line while the resident scrambled with the chart. "And I want neurology paged, not messaged, paged." "You're not authorized to," the resident started. "Page neurology," Nia said again, not loudly, just clearly. He paged neurology. Dr. Cole arrived 7 minutes later, flushed from wherever he'd come from, and took in the scene with the expression of someone who understood immediately what had happened and was deciding whether to be grateful or defensive. "What do we have?" he asked, and Nia gave him the rundown in 45 seconds flat. Vitals trending, neurosigns, her clinical assessment, what she'd already initiated. He listened, reviewed the monitor. Checked Emily's pupils himself. His face changed. "Let's get neurology in here and get her to imaging," he said. "Good catch." Nia stepped back and let him take the lead, the way she was supposed to. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The part of her that had been holding everything tight since the moment she pressed that button began, carefully, to release. 90 minutes later, Emily was in the ICU stable, the neurology team having confirmed a condition that, untreated for another 20 minutes, would have been fatal. Nia was sitting in the break room with a paper cup of cold coffee when she became aware of someone in the doorway. She looked up. A man stood at the threshold. Not a doctor, not staff. He was perhaps early 40s, dressed in the way that truly wealthy people dressed, which was to say quietly and without visible effort. Dark jacket, no tie, the kind of watch that didn't need to announce itself. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately place. Not gratitude, not grief, not the specific stunned quality of a parent who had nearly lost a child. Something more contained than all of that. Watchful. Measuring. She didn't know him. She would later learn his name. For now, she held his gaze for a moment, and he held hers, and then he turned and walked back into the corridor without a word. She sat with the cold coffee and the silence and the particular exhaustion that came after everything had happened and nothing had broken yet. She didn't know, in that quiet break room moment, that breaking was exactly what was coming. By the following morning, the story had already been shaped into something Nia didn't recognize. She had gone home at 6 a.m., slept for 4 hours in the clothes she'd worn to work, and returned a missed call from her sister Lena before dragging herself back toward the hospital for the mandatory follow-up meeting that the nursing supervisor had texted her about at 7:15. The text had been professional in language and cold in temperature. Please report to the administrative conference room, 3rd floor, at 10 a.m. regarding the events of last night's shift. This is a required attendance. She had stood in her kitchen reading it twice, her phone warm in her hand, Lena's voice still in her ear from the voicemail. Call me when you can, Nee. I heard something on the hospital grapevine, and I don't like the sound of it. The administrative conference room on the 3rd floor was not where meetings happened when everything was fine. Nia arrived at 9:55 in clean scrubs, her hair pulled back neatly, her face composed in the way she had practiced since childhood. Not blank, not aggressive, just present. Still. The face that said, I am here, and I am not afraid of you without saying a word. The room had a long table with 7 people already seated when she walked in. She recognized the hospital's head of human resources, a thin woman named Patricia Greer, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the particular energy of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer registered as anything special. Beside her sat 2 people Nia didn't know personally, but recognized as legal counsel from their suits and the arrangement of folders in front of them. There was a union representative at the far end, young, nervous, already avoiding her eyes, which told her something. Dr. Hale sat at the center of the table. He had the posture of a man who had prepared for this meeting the way you prepare for a speech you've already won. There was no physician from last night, no Dr. Cole, no neurology resident who had confirmed her assessment, no one from the ICU where Emily was, right now, alive. Nia sat in the single chair across from all of them and placed her hands flat on the table. Thank you for coming in, Patricia Greer said, in the tone that meant this has already been decided. The presentation of the previous night's events, as delivered by the hospital's legal counsel over the next 14 minutes, was so thoroughly different from what had happened that Nia spent the first few minutes simply listening with the detached attention of someone trying to understand a foreign language. In their version, Nia Carter had abandoned an assigned patient without authorization. She had commandeered emergency resources based on a personal clinical judgment she was not credentialed to make unilaterally. She had overridden physician directives, specifically the directives of Dr. Richard Hale, in a manner consistent with insubordination. And in doing so, she had created a delay in the care of Warren Aldridge, a patient whose condition had deteriorated during the period when staffing resources were diverted by her unauthorized intervention. The phrase they used, more than once, was reckless deviation from protocol. They did not mention that Emily was alive. They mentioned Warren Aldridge 4 times in 14 minutes. Nia waited until they finished. Then she said, "The child's blood pressure was dropping. Her pupils were unequal. My assessment indicated—" "Your assessment," the younger of the 2 attorneys interrupted, not rudely, but precisely, "is not the question before this board. The question is whether your actions conform to the standards of conduct required of nursing staff at this institution." "I saved her life," Nia said. She said it without heat, without drama, the way you state a fact that doesn't need decoration. There was a brief silence. Dr. Hale leaned forward slightly, and when he spoke, his voice had the particular warmth of a man who has rehearsed sounding reasonable. "Nurse Carter, no one is dismissing the outcome. But outcomes don't justify process violations. If every nurse on this floor acted on individual judgment in defiance of physician direction, this hospital would not function." "With respect, Dr. Hale, no physician was with that child. She was deteriorating, and you were not her assigned physician. You were not her assigned nurse." He let that settle. "Your job was to maintain your designated responsibilities. You chose otherwise." The union representative cleared his throat and said something that Nia barely heard about documentation timelines and grievance procedures. She was looking at Hale's face, specifically at the area around his eyes, where a different kind of person might have shown something. Discomfort. Awareness. The faint acknowledgement that a room full of people were participating in something that would be difficult to look back on cleanly. There was nothing there, just the practiced calm of a man for whom this was administrative not moral. Patricia Greer slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Given the severity of the protocol violations and the impact on patient care, she said, the hospital has made the decision to terminate your employment effective immediately, pending a formal review period. Additionally, a report has been filed with the state nursing board recommending a review of your license. Nia looked at the paper. She had known, walking in, that this was possible. She had told herself on the walk from the parking garage that she was prepared. She found now that prepared and ready were two different things. You're recommending a license review, she said. The board will make their own determination, Greer said. I want it on record, Nia said, that I reject the characterization of my actions as reckless. I want it on record that the child, Emily, is alive in the ICU right now because of the intervention I performed, and I want it on record that I was given a direct instruction to deprioritize a deteriorating pediatric patient in favor of a donor patient. There was a different kind of silence this time. Hale's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, barely, just a fraction of a degree, and Nia filed it away. Your objections are noted, Patricia Greer said. You'll have the opportunity to provide a full statement to the nursing board during their review. The meeting ended 11 minutes later. Security Chief Barnes was waiting outside the conference room door when Nia stepped out. He was a big man, late 40s, with a face that had clearly wanted to be somewhere else all morning. He didn't meet her eyes when he said, I'm going to need to walk you out, Ms. Carter. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at the wall just past her shoulder. Give me a minute, she said. She walked back to the nursing locker room alone, changed out of her scrubs, folded them neatly, and placed them on the bench. She gathered her personal items, her phone charger, the photograph of her and Lena she kept taped inside her locker door, the small emergency kit she'd kept stocked since her first year on the floor. She looked at the locker one more time. Then she walked back out and let Barnes walk her down. The main corridor on the second floor was the most trafficked area of the hospital in the late morning. Nurses coming off rounds, orderlies pushing carts, visitors carrying flowers. Barnes walked beside her at a careful distance, not touching her arm, not rushing her, but present enough that no one watching would have missed what was happening. Some of them watched. A charge nurse named Dolores, who Nia had worked alongside for 3 years, made eye contact with her from across the corridor, and then looked quickly away, back at the chart in her hands. They had eaten lunch together dozens of times. Dolores had come to Nia's small birthday gathering last spring, brought a card, hugged her at the door. Nia watched her look away and felt the particular coldness of that specific kind of abandonment. Not surprising, just final. A young tech named Marcus, who Nia had shown how to read an EKG strip in his first week, looked up from a cart he was stocking and then found something very important to look at on the ceiling. He was 23, needed the job more than he needed to be seen standing with her. She understood. A nurse named Janelle, newer to the floor, stopped completely and watched with an expression that sat somewhere between horror and the helpless paralysis of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had calculated exactly what they stood to lose by intervening. Janelle's mouth opened slightly. Then the moment passed, and her gaze dropped to the floor. Nia kept her head level and her pace steady. She was not going to give this hallway anything to remember except that she had walked through it the same way she had walked through it every other day, with her back straight and her face her own. She was outside in the hospital parking lot when Barnes said quietly, "For what it's worth." "Don't," she said. Not unkindly, just firmly. She didn't want worth right now. She didn't have a place to put it. He nodded and went back inside. The morning was bright and ordinary and indifferent, the way mornings were. Nia stood in the parking lot next to her car and let herself feel it, all of it, the full weight of the last 12 hours dropping onto her at once. The exhaustion and the anger and the specific grief of having done something right and been punished for it anyway. The fear beneath all of it, the practical, bill-shaped, a license review-shaped fear that she had been holding at bay with composure since the moment she'd walked into that conference room. She sat in the driver's seat and didn't start the car for a long time. She thought about how it felt to walk into this hospital the first time as a nurse, the badge, The ID photo taken on a Tuesday in October 6 years ago, her hair slightly too neat, her smile slightly too formal, the nerves she'd kept off her face. She thought about the first patient she had ever coded alone, a 60-year-old man named Gerald who had come through and later sent a card to the nursing station, and the way she had sat in her car afterward and cried not from grief, but from the relief of having been enough. She thought about Lena, a Lena who worked double shifts at the pharmacy, and then came home and made dinner for 2 kids and still somehow called Nia every other day to check on her, to laugh about nothing, to be the warm, steady thing in Nia's life that Nia privately depended on more than she ever said. Lena's oldest needed braces. Lena's rent had gone up in January. Nia had been quietly helping cover the gap for 8 months. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until the pressure pushed back against the tears that were trying to come. Then she sat up, took a breath, and started the car. She didn't see the black sedan parked at the far end of the lot, facing her direction. She didn't see the man inside it, the same man from the break room doorway the night before, watching her drive away. And she didn't see the way he sat for a long moment after she left, very still, before picking up his phone and placing a call. Back inside the hospital, on the 4th floor of the ICU, a small girl with dark hair was trying to sit up against her pillows. A nurse was trying to settle her back down, explaining gently that she needed to rest. Emily wasn't interested in resting. She pulled the oxygen line slightly away from her face and looked at the nurse with the particular directness of a child who was used to adults not fully listening. "The nurse," she said, her voice thin but clear. "The one last night. Where is she?" The ICU nurse paused. "She was a black lady," Emily said, as if this would help locate her. "She held my hand when I was scared. I wasn't supposed to be scared because I was supposed to be asleep, but I wasn't all the way asleep. She held my hand." The nurse smiled in the careful way you smiled when you didn't have an honest answer. "I'll pass that along, sweetheart." Emily looked at her for a long moment. Then she lay back against the pillows and looked at the ceiling with the thoughtful expression of a child filing something away. Outside in the corridor, a man the ICU staff hadn't seen before stood very quietly, a few feet from the nurse's station, having heard every word. His name was Daniel Whitmore. Emily was his daughter, and he had been in this hospital since last night, watching. 3 days after Riverside General escorted Nia Carter out of its building, the world kept moving in the indifferent way it always did. Traffic ran, groceries needed buying. On Lena's kids still had to be picked up from school at 3:15, and the electric bill still arrived on the 1st of the month without any interest in what kind of week you were having. Nia had moved through those 3 days on autopilot, showering, eating, sitting at the small kitchen table in the apartment she and Lena shared on the east side of the city, staring at her phone without really seeing it. She had filed the initial paperwork in response to the nursing board notification. She had spoken twice with the union representative, who had used the phrase "limited options" so many times it had started to feel like a verdict rather than an assessment. She had not cried again after the parking lot. She was saving that for somewhere she didn't know yet. Lena had handled it the way Lena handled everything, practically, and with a love that didn't need to announce itself. She had come home the first night with a container of jerk chicken from the place on Maple that Nia liked, set it on the table without ceremony, and sat across from her sister and said, "Tell me what actually happened. Not how are you feeling or what's your plan. Just tell me what happened," which was exactly right because Nia didn't have feelings she could organize yet. She had facts, and Lena listened to all of them with the focused quiet of someone cataloging information for later use. Lena worked 2 jobs and raised 2 kids and had not had an easy year or an easy 5 years, and she still sat at that table for an hour and a half without looking at her phone once. When Nia finished, Lena had gotten up without a word, refilled both their glasses with water, and sat back down. She had that look on her face, the one Nia had known since childhood, the one that meant Lena was sorting through something, and when she came out the other side, she would have something useful to say, not just something comforting. "They moved a child to the bottom of the list for a man with money," Lena said. "Yes." "And when you moved her back to the top, they fired you for it." That's the version they're not putting in writing, Nia said. What they're putting in writing is protocol violation. Lena nodded slowly. So the story they're telling is that you broke the rules. Yes. And the story that's actually true is that following the rules would have gotten a little girl killed. Nia looked at her sister. Yes. Lena was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Oh, then we act like we know the difference." But in the private hours between midnight and morning, when Lena's kids were asleep and the apartment was completely still, Nia sat with the doubt she wouldn't allow herself in daylight. She replayed the night in the ER frame by frame, the way you examine a photograph for something you might have missed the first time. Had she been reckless? Not in the clinical sense. She knew her assessment had been correct. The ICU team had confirmed it in terms clear enough that not even Hale's lawyers could contest the outcome. But had some part of her, some stubborn, fed-up part, grabbed the moment as a way to push back against an instruction that had always felt wrong? Was there pride in there somewhere, tangled up in the medicine? She thought about the years she had spent at Riverside General, watching the donor wall in the lobby mean something it wasn't supposed to mean. Watching certain patients get the slightly warmer version of everyone's attention, the slightly faster response time, the slightly fuller explanation of options. She had never called it out. She had told herself it was the way of the world, that her job was to give every patient the best she had and not to audit the system around her. She had been disciplined about that distinction for 6 years. So when Hale gave the instruction that left Emily deteriorating while everyone clustered around Aldridge, was her response medical judgment, or was it 6 years of swallowed frustration finally breaking the surface at the exact moment it could justify itself as the right thing? She sat with that, honestly. And then she thought about Emily's lips going gray at the edges, the asymmetric pupils, the breathing irregularity she had caught in the silence after Hale left. Whatever her reasons were, all of them, pride included, Emily was alive. That wasn't nothing. That was, in fact, everything. She decided she could carry the complicated parts of her own motivation without letting them cancel the outcome. She was sitting with that on the 4th morning when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. But something, the same instinct that had made her press the emergency button in Bay 2, made her answer. Nia. The voice was male, older, measured in the way of someone choosing words carefully. It's Marcus Patel. She sat up straighter. Doctor. Marcus Patel had been at Riverside General for 19 years. Longer than almost anyone on the clinical staff. He was a senior physician, quiet, methodical, the kind of doctor who made rounds without drama and whose opinions, when offered, carried weight precisely because he offered them so rarely. Nia had worked alongside him for 3 of her 6 years at the hospital and had respected him in the careful way you respect someone who clearly knows more than they share. Dr. Patel, she said, I can't speak long. I'm not calling from my office. I'm outside. A pause long enough to feel deliberate. I need to say something I should have said before you walked out of that building. She waited. You saved that child's life. You know that. But Nia, what you need to understand is that you stepped into something that was already moving before Emily ever came through those ER doors. Something that goes well beyond one bad night and one bad decision by a man protecting his reputation. She was very still. What do you mean? The initial diagnosis she was given, the one that had her triaged lower than the donor patient, wasn't an accident. Or if it was a remarkably convenient one. His voice stayed level, but she could hear the controlled breathing of someone who had been carrying something too long and was finally setting it down. There have been other cases over the past 2 years, patients presenting with symptoms that didn't match their official charts. Outcomes that were quietly absorbed into paperwork. I noticed the pattern months ago, Nia, and I said nothing. That is mine to carry. Dr. Patel, I'm not looking for your forgiveness. I'm giving you what I can because you're the one who pulled the thread, and you deserve to know what it's connected to. He lowered his voice slightly. The donor patient that night, Warren Aldridge, he isn't simply a hospital benefactor. He's a principal investor in a private medical research subsidiary. That subsidiary has been running clinical trials through this hospital for approximately 2 years. Trials that were never filed with the regulatory bodies they should have been filed with. Trials that patients never consented to. The kitchen felt very quiet. Emily wasn't supposed to be included, he continued. She came in as a standard pediatric case. But there's a flagging protocol embedded in the intake system, one I believe Hale personally authorized, that routes certain admissions into a parallel treatment track. Something in her intake data matched the profile. It should have been caught before it went anywhere. It wasn't. What did she receive? Nia asked. The silence that followed was long. I don't have documentation I can place in your hands today, he said finally. But I'm working toward it. In the meantime, do not file any additional statements with the nursing board until you've spoken to someone completely outside the hospital system. And Nia, check your personal notes, the ones you kept for yourself, not the chart. If you recorded anything that night in your own hand, keep those pages somewhere safe and don't mention them to anyone. The call ended there. Nia sat at the kitchen table without moving for several minutes. The coffee in her cup had gone cold. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood carried on with their usual indifference. A car backing out of a driveway, someone's radio from the upstairs unit, the particular creak of the building settling that she had stopped hearing months ago and now suddenly heard again. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that there was something larger underneath the surface of that night. Hale's response had been too quick, too prepared, too clean to be the reaction of someone merely protecting institutional reputation. The hearing had been organized with the speed of something that had contingency plans already drafted. The way the legal team had moved, not to discover what happened, but to establish the version of what happened, that wasn't crisis management. That was a rehearsal. She thought about the patients Dr. Patel had described, other cases, unexplained outcomes quietly reclassified, a pattern he had noticed months ago and said nothing about. She didn't blame him for the silence. She understood deeply what silence cost and what speaking cost more. But the timeline troubled her. Months. How many people had passed through Riverside General in that time, received something they hadn't agreed to, and left without knowing? She thought about the notebook. She pulled her bag from the hook by the door and found it, the small spiral-bound notebook she'd carried since the documentation dispute 2 years ago. It's a precaution that had felt almost paranoid at the time and now felt like the most important decision she had made in her professional life. She turned to the page from Tuesday night. Her own handwriting, time-stamped by habit, Emily's vitals at each interval, she'd checked them. The 2 paging attempts to Dr. Cole, notated with the times. Hale's instruction recorded in the flat shorthand she used for direct orders. Dr. H. Continue Aldridge coverage. Child can wait. Her clinical observations as she'd made them, in the quick abbreviations that only made full sense to her. And at the bottom, a single line written as an automatic clinical note. Presentation inconsistent with reported history. Symptoms pre-existing beyond stated onset. Ask re prior treatment. She stared at those 2 lines. She had written them out of habit. The reflex of a nurse who had trained herself to flag anything that didn't fit the picture. She had meant to follow up on them once Emily was stable enough for a full conversation. She had never followed up because she had been walked out of the building before morning. But now those words carried a different weight. Pre-existing beyond stated onset. What if Emily's symptoms weren't developing that night? What if they were the continuation of something already administered? What if what Nia had recognized as a worsening condition was actually a body responding to something it had been given, and the misdiagnosis had been engineered to buy the program time? She put the notebook carefully in the inside pocket of her jacket rather than her bag, closer to her body, harder to lose, harder to take. 2 days after that, a local news segment aired. 3.5 minutes. It described Nia as a nurse who had departed from established protocol during a high-stakes emergency situation, who had substituted personal clinical judgment for physician direction, and whose termination had followed a formal institutional review. There was a clip of a hospital spokesperson delivering the phrase, "Patient safety is our highest priority," with the particular conviction of someone who had practiced it in a mirror. Emily was not mentioned. The word survived did not appear anywhere in the 3.5 minutes. The segment ended on a brief graphic listing the hospital's quality ratings. Lena watched it from the doorway with her arms folded and her expression doing the quiet work of someone choosing not to say everything they were thinking. "Oh, they left out the part where the child lived," Lena said. "They left out the part where there was a child," Nia said. "They've written the story they want." "Yes." "Then we write a different one," Lena said. Not a question, a statement of direction. That night, after Lena had gone to bed and the apartment was quiet again, Nia sat at the kitchen table and turned her notebook to a fresh page. She began writing down everything, not just the clinical details of that Tuesday night, but the sequence of conversations, the hearing, the things Dr. Patel had said on the phone. She wrote it in the kind of order that a person outside the situation could follow, with timestamps where she had them and clear notation of what she had observed firsthand versus what she had been told. She wrote for almost an hour, till she was capping her pen when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You have no idea what you're standing in the middle of. Walk away now, while you still can." She read it twice. The politeness of it was the part that stayed with her. Not angry, not aggressive, just a practical note, the way you'd tell someone the road ahead was washed out. It was the message of someone who believed they were being reasonable. She set the phone face down on the table. Then she put the notebook in the inside pocket of her jacket, hung the jacket on the hook by the door, where she would reach for it first thing in the morning, and went to bed. She did not walk away. The next morning came in gray and damp, the tail end of a slow October rain that had moved through overnight and left everything outside looking wrung out. Nia was making coffee when 2 short knocks came at the front door, unhurried even, the knock of someone who had decided to be present and wasn't anxious about the reception. She looked through the peephole and found a man in a dark coat standing in the hallway. He was looking directly at the door, not at his phone, not at the wall beside it, but at the door itself, as though he understood she was on the other side deciding something. She opened it. Up close, Daniel Whitmore looked less polished than he had appeared in hospital corridors. Not disheveled, she could see he was put together with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to it. But there was something concentrated around his eyes that belonged to a person running on too little sleep and declining to perform otherwise. Early 40s, lean, or with the kind of stillness that reads as control rather than calm. "My name is Daniel Whitmore," he said. "Emily is my daughter." Nia studied him. "I know who you are," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not relief. More like the acknowledgement that she was going to be exactly as sharp as he had assessed. "I'd like to talk," he said, "if you're willing. I know I have no standing to ask anything of you." She held the door for a moment, then she stepped back and let him in. He sat at the kitchen table and looked around the apartment with an expression that was not judgment. It was something closer to reckoning, a man recalibrating his sense of scale. Nia poured 2 coffees without asking whether he wanted one and set one in front of him and took the chair across the table. In the same chair she had sat in for the last week, rebuilding herself out of whatever was left after Riverside General had finished with her. "I saw you in the break room that night," she said, "and in the parking lot the next day." He nodded once. "You watched them walk me out?" "Yes." She waited. He seemed to understand that she wasn't going to make this easy for him, and he didn't ask her to. "Why didn't you say anything before I left the building? You could have, at minimum, told them who you were. That might have complicated things." "It would have complicated them in the wrong direction," he said. "If I'd identified myself at that moment, the hospital's response would have shifted entirely to managing my involvement rather than accounting for what they'd done. They would have moved faster to clean up the record and slower to expose anything true. I needed them to believe, for a little while, that no one with resources was watching." He paused. "I'm sorry for what that cost you in those days." It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement. Nia registered the difference, and set it aside for now. Emily's mother brought her in, he said. We share custody. She had Emily for the week. I was notified when Emily went unresponsive and I got to the hospital within 40 minutes. I arrived just as you were initiating the intervention. I watched everything that came after. And the next morning. And the next morning, he said. Nia looked at him steadily. Your daughter was nearly killed by a hospital program you may not have known existed. How does a man with your resources not know what's happening at a hospital in his own city? The question landed in the space between them. He didn't look away from it. Because I wasn't looking, he said. I've donated to Riverside General for 4 years. Facility improvements, research endowment. I trusted that the institutional reputation I was funding was real. That was a mistake. He said it with the flatness of a man not accustomed to admitting mistakes, but understanding this wasn't a moment where anything other than directness was going to work. What I should have been paying attention to, I wasn't. Emily paid for that. So did you. Nia held that for a moment. Then she said, Tell me what you found. I spent the days after doing what I do when a situation requires understanding before action, he said. I have resources. I used them carefully. He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and set a thin folder on the table. What I've found is worse than I anticipated when I started looking. Nia looked at the folder but didn't immediately open it. Tell me first, she said. He told her. His voice stayed flat and factual in the way that people used when the facts themselves were too large for emphasis. Riverside General had been operating an unsanctioned clinical program for approximately 2 years. A small, targeted patient pool. Funded through a private research subsidiary in which Warren Aldridge was a principal investor and several other high-net-worth donors held financial interests. The patients in this program had not consented to participation. Most of them didn't know they had been included. Our complications that couldn't be explained through normal channels were quietly reclassified in the official record. Emily had not been an intended participant. A flagging error in the intake system had pulled her case into the program's pipeline. By the time any human review would have caught it, she was already crashing, because the flagging was automated and nobody was watching it carefully, or because someone was watching it and didn't stop it in time. Daniel didn't speculate on which. He stated what he knew. Nia opened the folder. Inside were printed communications, internal formatting, hospital domain headers, and a sequence of patient file reference numbers. She read the first page fully and turned to the third and stopped. There it was. This in a field she had filled in hundreds of times on standard intake forms, a single alphanumeric code that did not belong there. She had never seen that code in 6 years on the floor. It had no designation in the standard intake taxonomy she had been trained on. This was in Emily's chart, she said. In the version that wasn't submitted to official records, yes. The submitted version doesn't contain it. There are 2 copies of her intake form with different data in the same field. He paused. One for external record, one for the program. Nia set the folder down slowly. You could have taken this to the police 6 days ago, she said, or to a journalist. Why come to me first? Because moving publicly before the documentation is fully secured gives them time to run cleanup, he said. I've watched situations like this get managed by good legal teams and bad organizations enough times to know how the counter-narrative works. You go loud before you have everything locked, and they spend the next several weeks running distraction while the real evidence disappears into amended files and resigned employees. His voice was quiet and precise. And because your testimony is a piece of this that can't be manufactured. You were there. You made a clinical call that saved my daughter's life and directly interrupted what the program had set in motion for her. What you observed that night in your own record is documentation they can't retroactively alter. Nia thought about the notebook under her mattress. Someone texted me last night, she said, told me to walk away. I know, he said. That's part of why I'm here today instead of tomorrow. She looked at him across the kitchen table and did the quiet, honest work of deciding what she believed about him. Not whether he was wealthy, that was obvious and beside the point. Not whether his intentions were clean, she couldn't know that yet, but whether the thing she could see in him, the thing that looked like a father who had nearly lost a child and understood clearly how close it had been, was real. Whether he was here because Emily mattered, or because his name being attached to a hospital scandal mattered in a different way. She looked at him for a long time. He didn't move to fill the silence. She decided she didn't need to trust him completely. She just needed to decide if fighting in the same direction was the right thing, regardless of his reasons. What do you need from me right now?" she asked. He reached back into his coat and placed a second document on the table, a formal witness statement template, partially filled in, her name at the top. "Sign this. It makes you an official cooperating witness with the investigative team I've brought in. Federal adjacent, private, fully credentialed. Once you sign, they can't pursue action against your license without going through a legal wall that will take them considerably longer than this process will." She pulled the document toward her. "Read it from the beginning. Slowly, every line, the way her mother had always insisted you read anything before your name went on it." It was what it claimed to be. She was reaching for the pen when her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen. A text from Dr. Patel. "They've started deleting records. It's happening now." She looked up at Daniel. His phone was already in his hand. "It's starting," he said. "I know." She picked up the pen and signed. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was still the flat gray of a day that hadn't decided what it wanted to be. But somewhere across the city, at the private airstrip behind Riverside General, something was already moving. Something that had been in motion since before this morning, since before Nia opened her front door, since perhaps before the night in the ER that started all of this. A series of carefully arranged pieces settling into position. A long white aircraft was clearing the clouds on its approach. Unhurried. Precise. The kind of arrival that didn't announce itself because it didn't have to. Down in the hospital, while in his fourth-floor office, Dr. Richard Hale stood at his window and watched it descend. He had been a hospital administrator for 22 years. In that time, he had managed investigations, lawsuits, malpractice claims, staff scandals, and 2 separate incidents involving controlled substances. He had navigated all of them because he understood the fundamental principle underlying most institutional crises. The person with the most organized information and the most willing legal team almost always won. He had the legal team. He had spent the last week organizing information in ways that would make it very difficult to reconstruct anything he didn't want reconstructed. He had moved carefully and methodically with the confidence of a man who had survived long enough to know that most threats were manageable if you stayed ahead of them. He had not anticipated this. He watched the aircraft come to rest at the far end of the airstrip, watched the stairs lower, watched the first of the suited figures step down onto the tarmac. There were 5 of them. They moved with a precision that had nothing in common with the normal flow of any person who arrived at a hospital for ordinary reasons. His phone rang. Head of legal. He answered it. "Richard." The voice was stripped of its usual professional warmth. "Do not speak to anyone, not board members, not department heads, no one on staff, until I'm in that building. Are you understanding me?" "What is this?" he said, though he already suspected. "It's a federal inquiry, Richard, private contractor, but with federal authorization. Someone with serious resources requested it." A pause. "Don't touch any more files. I mean anything. And if IT is still running that audit you authorized, I'll stop it. Stop it immediately. And, Richard," the voice dropped, "don't call Aldridge. Don't text him. Don't have your assistant reach out. Don't let his name appear in any communication from your devices between now and when I get there. Do you understand?" Hale said he understood. He ended the call. He stood at the window a moment longer. Outside, the suited figures had crossed the tarmac and were approaching the hospital's rear entrance. A security guard at the door was checking credentials that were apparently sufficient because the door opened and they went through without slowing. Hale turned from the window and sat back down at his desk. While he looked at the organized surface of it, the clean lines and filed folders and the controlled environment he had maintained for 2 decades, and for the first time in a long career of difficult mornings, he had no procedure for the one he was standing in. His phone rang again. He looked at the screen. He didn't answer it. The aircraft did not announce itself the way powerful things sometimes did. There were no sirens, no formal notifications sent to administration, no courtesy call to the front desk. It simply landed, clean and quiet, on the rear airstrip, and that absence of announcement was itself a statement. People who needed to prepare you for their arrival were people who needed something from you. These people did not. Word moved through Riverside General the way word always moved through hospitals, not through official channels, but through the low, quick current of staff conversation, the glance between nurses at the station, the tech who saw the aircraft from the break room window and told the orderly in the hall, who told the charge nurse on 3, who told everyone else within minutes. By the time the rear entrance doors opened to admit the team from the jet, half the hospital staff knew something was happening, and the other half were about to find out. There were 5 of them, 4 men and a woman, all in dark professional clothing, all carrying document cases or equipment bags with the efficiency of people for whom this kind of entry was ordinary work. The woman led. She was perhaps 50, silver-streaked hair, pulled back, the kind of face that had processed a great deal of information over a long career and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. She carried credentials that she presented to the security guard at the rear entrance without breaking stride, and the guard looked at them and stepped aside without comment. Security Chief Barnes was summoned from his office within 3 minutes of the team's entry. He met them in the rear corridor, took the documents handed to him, and read them with the expression of a man understanding, line by line, that the situation had changed in a way that was not going to change back. "This is a formal notice of investigative authority," the woman, she introduced herself only as Supervisor Crane, said. "All digital systems, patient records, internal communications, and administrative files are to be considered under preservation order, effective immediately. Nothing is to be deleted, transferred, or modified. That includes any ongoing internal audit or data review currently in progress." Barnes thought about the IT audit Hale had authorized 3 days ago. He thought about the specific instruction he had received that very morning. Access the server logs, enable the audit team's permissions, don't document it through official channels. He thought about how clean that instruction had seemed at the time and how unclean it looked now in the context of the documents in his hands. He thought about his 17 years at this hospital, about his pension, about his daughter starting college in the fall. He made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. "Understood," he said. "I'll need to make one call immediately. There's an internal IT process currently running that will need to be halted." Crane looked at him with the measuring attention of someone assessing trustworthiness in real time. "Make the call in front of me," she said. He did. He called the hospital's IT supervisor, told him to suspend all active audit operations and step away from every system until further notice. And he did it standing 3 feet from Supervisor Crane with no inflection that suggested anything other than full cooperation. When he ended the call, Crane gave him a single nod. He would later reflect that this was the moment he chose which side of things he was on. At the time, it hadn't felt like a choice so much as arithmetic, the kind that becomes simple once you have the right information. "Doctor." Hale came downstairs 11 minutes after Barnes sent the notification to his office. He had composed himself in the interim, pressed jacket, measured expression, the professional effect of a man arriving to manage a situation. He crossed the lobby toward Supervisor Crane with his hand extended and his most practiced version of collegial authority on his face. She looked at his hand and then at him. "Dr. Hale, you'll want to have your legal counsel present before we speak formally. I'd suggest you make that call in the next few minutes." She handed him a copy of the documentation she had given Barnes. "In the meantime, please don't access your office computer or any hospital systems. Your assistant has already been notified." His hand dropped. The composed expression remained. But something beneath it shifted, a recalibration so subtle that only someone watching for it would have caught it. Hale was a man who had spent his career reading rooms and adjusting accordingly. He was reading this one now, and what he was reading was not something he had a prepared response for. He took the documents and walked to the far side of the lobby and made a phone call. It was in that same hour that Daniel Whitmore walked through the hospital's front entrance for the first time as something other than a quiet observer. He did not make a dramatic entrance of it. He came through the main doors in the same dark coat he had worn to Nia's apartment that morning, signed in at the visitor's desk with his actual name, and crossed the lobby toward Supervisor Crane without hurrying and without announcement. She saw him coming, and something in her expression registered recognition before composure reasserted itself. Staff nearby, who had been watching the morning's strange proceedings, now watched a well-dressed man greet the lead investigator with the quiet familiarity of people who had spoken before today. And they began to understand, gradually, that the aircraft on the airstrip and the man in the lobby were connected. That this had been organized before it arrived. That whatever was happening had been happening for longer than the morning. Dr. Hale, from across the lobby, watched Daniel Whitmore and did the same calculation that people always did when they saw Daniel in professional contexts. The quiet clothes, the absence of display, the way the room arranged itself around him rather than him arranging himself around the room. Hale had met men like Daniel before. He understood immediately what that presence in his lobby meant. He returned to his phone call and spoke more quietly. In the early afternoon, Nia arrived. She came through the same front entrance she had been walked out of 6 days ago, and the symmetry of it was not lost on her. She wore street clothes, no scrubs, no badge, and she carried the notebook in her jacket pocket and the knowledge that she was here now as a witness, not as an employee. The distinction mattered. It meant no one in this building had authority over her today. Barnes met her in the lobby. He looked at her for a moment and then said quietly, "For what it's worth, I'm glad you came back." She remembered him saying the same kind of thing in the parking lot when he walked her out. She nodded and let it mean something this time. Supervisor Crane's team had established a working space in the ground floor conference room. Nia was shown in and asked to give an initial account. Not a formal recorded statement yet, just a walkthrough of the night as she had experienced it, starting from when Emily was brought in. She sat at the table and spoke clearly and without embellishment, and when she reached the point in the account where Hale had given the instruction to deprioritize Emily, she removed the notebook from her pocket and set it on the table. The investigator across from her, a younger man who had been taking notes, looked at the notebook and then at her. "That's my personal record from that night," she said. "Time-stamped. It includes the instruction as given, the vitals at each interval, and an observation I made about the inconsistency in Emily's presentation relative to her reported history." He picked it up with the careful attention of someone recognizing what they were holding. In the corridors outside, the morning was coming undone in increments. 3 junior nurses who had been on duty that Tuesday night were brought in separately for conversations that their union rep, newly arrived, monitored from the hallway. Each of them came in guarded and left looking lighter in the particular way of people who have been carrying something heavy and have finally set it down, however uncertain what comes next. A hospital pharmacist, who had been visibly anxious since the team's arrival, asked Barnes privately how to go about providing information voluntarily. Barnes walked him through it without editorializing. The pharmacist sat with that information for 20 minutes and then walked into the conference room on his own. He had records, not personal notes, actual dispensary logs that he had printed and kept at home 2 months ago when something in the medication request patterns had struck him as wrong, and he hadn't known what to do with that feeling. He had done nothing with them for 2 months. He was doing something with them now. Nurse Janelle, the younger nurse who had watched Nia's walk out of the building with her mouth half open and her gaze on the floor, came to the conference room door at 11 in the morning and knocked. And when the door opened, she said she had something she wanted to say and asked whether she needed a lawyer present first. She was told she could have one if she wanted one, and she said she didn't. And she sat down and gave an account of the instruction she had overheard 2 days before the night in question, a conversation between Hale and the Deputy Director of Operations about ensuring that Protocol 7's flagging codes were updated to current patient intake parameters. She had not understood what she was hearing at the time. She understood it now. The IT team, Crane's, not the hospital's, had stationed themselves at a server access point on the second floor. They worked quickly and without commentary. By mid-afternoon, the hospital's administrative floor had the atmosphere of a building where everyone was doing the same ordinary tasks they always did, while privately understanding that nothing was ordinary anymore. Staff spoke in lower voices. Doors that were usually left open were pulled mostly closed. People moved between floors with the particular purposefulness of those who did not want to be still when things were in motion around them. Hale sat in a small meeting room with his legal counsel, who had arrived just after noon, tight-faced and speaking very little in front of anyone, and waited. He was no longer managing anything. He was waiting. That was new. And in the ICU on the 4th floor, a small girl with dark hair who had been recovering for 6 days looked up when Daniel came through the door and said, "Daddy." Just that. No drama, just the plain relief of a child who had been frightened and is now less frightened because the person she trusted most is in the room. He sat beside her bed and took her hand. They talked quietly about when she could go home, about whether they could get the Italian food she liked, about her bear and whether the hospital had been treating him well. It was the conversation of a father and daughter finding their way back to ordinary things after the extraordinary had passed close enough to feel. At some point, Emily looked at him with the focused expression she wore when she was about to say something that mattered to her. "Is the nurse who saved me in trouble?" she asked. Daniel looked at his daughter, at the face that in another version of this week he might not have seen again, and took a breath. "She's here today," he said, "and she's not in trouble anymore." Emily seemed to consider this carefully, the way she considered things that she needed to be true. Then she said, "I want to see her." "I know," he said. "Soon." The recovered data took until early evening to begin yielding usable information, which was faster than Supervisor Crane's team had expected, given how aggressively the hospital's internal IT audit had been moving. The deletion protocol that Hale had authorized 3 days ago had been running, but incompletely, the way things ran when they were rushed, and the people executing them were scared and not fully trained for what they were being asked to do. Fragments remained in places that the automated process hadn't reached. Those fragments were enough. By 6:30, the conference room held printed copies of recovered communications that formed, when laid in sequence, a pattern that was difficult to look at and impossible to explain innocently. The program had a name, not a dramatic one, just an internal designation, Protocol 7. It had been operating for 22 months, embedded in Riverside General's standard intake flow through a flagging code that routed certain patients into a secondary treatment track. The criteria for flagging were specific: patients in certain age and health profile categories presenting with conditions that matched parameters set by the program's external research sponsors, patients who were unlikely to have advocates watching closely, patients whose complications, if they occurred, would be easiest to absorb into ordinary clinical noise. The funding trail was cleaner than the clinical trail and therefore easier to trace. A private medical research company called Meridian Biopartners had been channeling payments to a subsidiary of the hospital's research foundation for 20 months. Warren Aldridge was listed as a principal investor in Meridian Biopartners. Now 2 other names on the investor list were board members of Riverside General. The night Emily was brought in, she had been automatically flagged by the intake system and routed into Protocol 7's secondary track. She was given a compound that was not part of her standard treatment, not approved for use in pediatric patients under emergency conditions, not disclosed to any guardian, not recorded in the official chart. The compound was part of an efficacy trial for a drug Meridian Biopartners was seeking regulatory approval for. It had not reached the stage of human trials through any legitimate process. Emily's body had reacted badly. Her crashing vitals that night were not a developing complication. They were a direct response to what she had been given. Nia, sitting in the conference room when the recovered records were walked through by one of Crane's team, listened to all of this in the careful stillness she had been holding for days. She listened to the name, Protocol 7, and heard it settle into the understanding she had been building since the phone call with Dr. Patel, since the line in her notebook, since the moment in Bay 2 when something had told her the picture in front of her didn't match the frame it had been put in. When the walkthrough finished, she sat for a moment and then said, "I wrote in my personal notes that her presentation was inconsistent with her reported history. I didn't know exactly what I was seeing, but I knew something was wrong that couldn't be explained by the initial diagnosis." "You knew enough," the investigator said. She thought about that phrase. You knew enough. She had spent 6 days wondering whether what she had done was enough, whether she had done it for the right reasons, whether pride had contaminated judgment. She thought about all of that, and then she set it down. Whatever had been in her motivation that night, she had known enough. She had acted. Emily was alive. What had saved Emily wasn't just the intervention, it was the timing. If Nia had waited another 20 minutes, if she had followed the instruction to stand down, to continue monitoring without acting, the compound's effects would have progressed past the point where intervention was possible. What Nia had done in Bay 2, acting on clinical instinct without authorization, had interrupted a process the hospital's own protocol had set in motion. Hale had not designed the program. That distinction, when it eventually mattered legally, would be meaningful, but only barely. He had approved the arrangement with Meridian Biopartners. He had authorized the flagging protocol's implementation in the intake system. He had known for at least 14 months what was running beneath the surface of his hospital's standard care. He had protected it because it was profitable and because the people funding it were the same people who funded the institution he had built his career inside. Dr. Marcus Patel was brought in at 7 in the evening. He arrived looking like a man who had not slept in 4 days, which was accurate. He had driven to the hospital himself. No one had summoned him, and told the front desk he needed to speak with the investigators. He was shown in within minutes. He sat down across from Supervisor Crane and placed a USB drive on the table before anyone asked him a question. "I've been collecting this for 8 weeks," he said. "I didn't know what to do with it. I know that's not an excuse." His voice was steady but stripped of its professional polish, the careful exterior he'd worn for 19 years. "There are 6 patient cases on that drive where I observed anomalies inconsistent with the official records. I documented what I could access without raising internal flags. I should have gone to someone external far sooner. I should have gone the first time I noticed the pattern." He looked at the drive on the table for a moment. "I stayed silent because I was afraid of what I knew and afraid of what it would cost me to say it. And a child nearly died in a way I might have prevented had I spoken sooner." He didn't look around the room for reassurance when he finished. He sat with what he had said, the way a person sits with something that needed to be said and has finally been. Nobody in the room told him it was all right. Nobody offered the comfort of diminishing it into something smaller than it was. That was, Nia would later reflect, the right response. Some things needed to be said plainly and received plainly, without being softened into something easier to carry. His drive, combined with the recovered data from the hospital system, gave investigators a documented record of 6 patients affected by Protocol 7 over 22 months. 2 had been discharged with complications attributed to their underlying conditions. One had died, a 67-year-old man whose family had been told his deterioration was expected given his prognosis. Whether that attribution was accurate or a cover was something the investigation would take weeks to determine. The night deepened and the conference room stayed lit and the work continued. At 9 o'clock, a leak reached the media. Nobody in Crane's team was responsible for it. It came from somewhere inside the hospital, a staff member whose conscience had finished its negotiation with their fear and come out on the side of disclosure. The first story ran online just before 10. Regional hospital under federal investigation. Patients allegedly used in unauthorized drug trials. Within the hour, 3 national outlets had picked it up. By midnight, news vans had arranged themselves in a row along the hospital's front entrance, their satellite arrays raised against the dark sky, their reporters doing the particular kind of composed but urgent delivery that accompanied stories that were still unfolding. Hale, still in the small meeting room with his legal counsel, was informed of the media presence by his attorney. The attorney had by that point advised Hale to say nothing to anyone, inside or outside the hospital, on any platform, through any representative, for the foreseeable future. Hale sat with that instruction and looked at the surface of the table. His attorney was speaking about timelines, about what could still be managed at the margins, about how certain distinctions in the documentary record might be presented. Hale listened and registered something that had been building since the aircraft landed. The language had shifted. It was no longer about protecting the institution. It was about protecting himself. That shift was its own kind of information about where this was going. He thought about 22 years, about the building that had his signature on every major initiative for 2 decades, the programs he had built, the board relationships he had cultivated, the reputation he had treated as both his product and his identity. He thought about how much of what he had protected he had told himself was for the institution, for the patients, for the standard of care, and how much of it, in the honest accounting that becomes unavoidable at a certain hour, had been for the version of himself he saw in the institution's success. He did not share any of this with his attorney. He sat with it alone. The warning call traced back shortly after 10. The text sent to Nia 6 days ago, "Walk away now while you still can," had been sent from a device registered to the hospital's deputy director of operations, a man who reported directly to Hale. He was reached by phone, informed of the discovery, and arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later with a personal attorney and the specific face of someone who had been running a very fast calculation for a very long time and had just reached the end of the road. At 11:15 that night, Nia was walking through the 4th-floor corridor toward the elevator when she passed the open doorway of a room at the end of the hall and stopped. Emily was awake. She was sitting up against her pillows with a stuffed bear tucked under one arm, looking at the doorway with the alert attention of a child who was still too young to feign sleep convincingly. The room was quiet. One lamp on, the monitors doing their steady work in the background, the particular warmth of a room where someone had been getting better. When Emily saw Nia in the doorway, something moved across her small face. Recognition first, and then relief. Both of them clean and uncomplicated by anything adults would have overlaid on top. "You're here," Emily said. Nia stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at this girl who 8 days ago had been a stranger on a stretcher, and was now, in some way that didn't have a clean clinical category, the reason the last week of Nia's life had happened the way it had. She walked in and pulled the chair beside the bed close and sat down. "I remember you," Emily said, with the directness of a child who had thought about this. "From when everything was loud and scary. The lights were too bright, and there were a lot of people talking too fast, but you were there and you talked to me slower." She paused, considering. "And you didn't leave, even when they wanted you to." Nia looked at her. "You were awake for some of that?" "Not all the way," Emily said, "but some of the way." Nia nodded. Emily reached over with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who understands comfort as a thing to be shared rather than kept, and placed the stuffed bear in Nia's lap. "You can hold him for a while," she said. "He helps." Nia looked down at the bear. Then she looked up at Emily. For the first time since the parking lot 6 days ago, something deep in Nia's chest released completely and did not come back. The news vans were still there the next morning and the morning after that, and by the 3rd day the story had moved from regional coverage to a national conversation that nobody at Riverside General had the authority to stop. Other families came forward. They came quietly at first, a phone call to a law office, an email to a journalist, a message sent through the hospital's patient advocacy line that got routed, irony of ironies, to the same investigative team that had flown in on the jet. A woman named Carol Briggs, 63 years old, whose husband had died 14 months ago of what the hospital had classified as expected deterioration. She had always felt, like in the way that surviving spouses sometimes felt, that something hadn't been explained to her fully. She had filed it away under grief and moved forward. Now she pulled it back out and handed it to someone who could actually look at it. A man named James Whitfield, whose teenage son had experienced a cardiac event following a routine procedure 2 years ago. Complications the hospital had called uncommon, but not suspicious. Uncommon was a word, James Whitfield said to the investigator across the table from him, that had kept him awake more nights than he could count. These were people who had been dismissed, who had asked questions and received the smooth institutional version of an answer, thorough-sounding, compassionate-seeming, and constructed to close the door rather than open it. Now the door was open, and they walked through it. Inside the hospital, Dr. Hale made his last move on a Wednesday afternoon. He had been in consultation with his legal team for 3 days. The strategy they arrived at had a particular flavor that Nia recognized when she was informed of it, not because she had predicted it specifically, but because she had understood Hale well enough by now to know that his final defense would not be contrition. It would be deflection. His attorneys filed a motion arguing that Nia's initial intervention had itself constituted the triggering event for Emily's complications, that her unauthorized administration of treatment to a patient already enrolled in a proprietary protocol had created a dangerous interaction, and that the hospital bore no liability for outcomes following unsanctioned nursing interference. That he was trying to make her the instrument of Emily's harm. The motion was filed on a Wednesday. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Thursday. Nia sat in a conference room with Daniel's legal team the night before and prepared. She was not afraid exactly. She was very still in the way of someone who has found the place inside themselves where the noise stops and only what is true remains. She had her notebook. She had her timeline. She had the clinical record of her assessment that night, independently verified by the neurology team who had confirmed her diagnosis within hours of the intervention. She had all of it organized in the particular order that made the truth impossible to mistake for anything else. She sat in the witness chair the next morning and spoke clearly and without anger. She described the vitals. She described the paging attempts. She described what she had observed in Emily's presentation that indicated the initial diagnosis was inconsistent with the clinical picture. She described the instruction she had been given, and when she quoted it exactly as she had written it in her notebook on the night it was given. The child can wait. She said it without drama because it didn't need any. The room was quiet when she said it. Not the strategic quiet of a room being managed, but the particular silence of a group of people who have just heard something true and cannot immediately find an angle from which it looks different. Hale's attorney made a note on his legal pad. The hearing panel chair looked at her over her reading glasses for a moment before looking back at her own documents. Nia sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her and waited for the next question. The recovered footage was presented in the afternoon session. Internal security camera logs showing the timestamp of Hale's entry to Bay 2, his instruction, and his departure, followed by the 11-minute window before Nia pressed the emergency button. The internal communications recovered by Crane's team were entered into the record. Protocol 7's documentation was submitted in full. Hale's attorneys argued for 3 hours. They used technical language and procedural objection and the particular exhausting architecture of legal defense that is designed to make clarity feel complicated. Hale himself sat at the table in a pressed suit and said nothing, which was either counsel's instruction or the calculation of a man who had decided that his voice, at this point, would only make things worse. Daniel spoke last. He had not prepared remarks in the formal sense. He had refused the prepared remarks his team had offered him and stood at the front of the room with nothing in his hands. He looked at the board members, at the hearing panel, at Hale's legal team arranged on the opposite side of the room, and he spoke the way a father spoke when everything formal had been exhausted, and what remained was simply what was true. My daughter was given something in this hospital without my knowledge, without her mother's knowledge, and without any disclosure to any person responsible for her care. She was 8 years old. Whatever professional or procedural framework this hearing operates inside, that is what happened here. He paused. The nurse who saved her life was fired the next morning for doing it. I want that on the record in plain language, not in any version that requires interpretation. She saw a child dying and she acted. That is the entirety of what Nia Carter did, and this institution punished her for it. The hearing panel deliberated for less than 2 hours. Dr. Richard Hale was removed from his position, placed under formal charges, and walked out of Riverside General by Barnes, the same security chief Barnes who had walked Nia out 8 days earlier. Barnes did not make eye contact with Hale during the walk. He kept his gaze ahead and his pace even, and his face its own. 3 board members resigned by end of day. Warren Aldridge's attorneys issued a statement that satisfied no one. The hospital's administration was placed under interim oversight pending a structural review. The story ran everywhere. Nia's name was in all of it, and for the first time, the name was attached to something accurate. She sat in the hospital parking lot that evening, the same lot, the same row, roughly the same time of day, and let herself feel the difference between this moment and the last time she had sat here. 8 days ago, she had pressed her hands against her eyes and held everything together through force of will. Tonight, she didn't have to hold anything. The weight had redistributed itself into something she could carry without bracing against it. It was significant. She gave it the time it deserved. Then she drove home to Lena. The nursing board's decision came 12 days later. Why, and it was unambiguous. Nia Carter's license was fully reinstated, the review recommendation dismissed, the record cleared. The board's written decision included a line that Nia read 3 times before she put it down. The actions taken by Ms. Carter on the night in question represent the standard of care that this profession exists to uphold. She folded the letter and kept it. The media cycle had its final turn with her story in the days after the hearing. A piece ran in a national publication under the headline, "The Nurse Who Stood Alone," and it told the story accurately, which was all she had ever wanted. She did one interview, short, measured, with a journalist she had vetted carefully, and said the things that were true and declined to say the things that were only satisfying. She did not perform her vindication. She received it quietly and kept moving. Lena made dinner the night the board decision came through. Nothing elaborate, the same kind of food they had always made in that kitchen, the practical, warm kind that didn't need an occasion to justify it. They sat at the table where Nia had sat with her doubt and her notebook and Daniel Whitmore's folder, and they ate and talked about ordinary things first. Lena's kids, a plumbing issue in the second bathroom that had been getting worse, something funny that had happened at the pharmacy where Lena worked. The conversation of people who are relieved and are choosing to let themselves be relieved by not immediately filling the relief with the next heavy thing. At some point, without preamble, Lena said, "I always knew you were going to be all right." "You didn't know that," Nia said. No," Lena agreed, easily. "But I acted like it. Same thing." Nia looked at her sister across the table and felt the particular gratitude that doesn't have the right words, the kind you carry instead of expressing because expressing it wouldn't contain it. Daniel came to see her on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the hearing. He sat at the kitchen table again with the same quiet that she had come to understand was not distance, but the way he inhabited space when something mattered to him. He had a proposal. He had been in conversation with a hospital development group and a team of healthcare policy consultants about building something new, not a rebranding of Riverside General, which was beyond rehabilitation, but a new facility, a different structure. We built around principles that were not abstract, transparent clinical protocols, independent ethics oversight, patient advocacy embedded at the institutional level rather than bolted on afterward. A place where the donor wall in the lobby did not determine what happened in the emergency room. He wanted her involved, not as a nurse to be employed, but as someone who helped shape how the place worked from the inside. A clinical ethics role, collaborative, with real authority. She sat with that for a long moment. She thought about what it had cost to trust a system and have it turn on her, about how easy it would be, given everything that had happened, to step away from institutions entirely and simply practice somewhere small and controllable, where the stakes were lower and the exposure was less. She had earned that option, and nobody would blame her for it. Then Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had come with Daniel, waiting in the living room with Lena's kids while the adults talked, and she had apparently decided that enough time had passed. She was carrying her stuffed bear, returned to her care after his brief loan to Nia in the ICU, and she had a folded piece of paper in her other hand that she was holding out toward Nia with the directness of a child delivering something important. Nia unfolded it. It was a drawing in crayon, a child's hand, imprecise and fully committed, the way children drew before they started worrying about whether it was good. There was a figure in the center in white, surrounded by yellow lines that were clearly meant to be light. Beside the figure was a smaller shape, a person lying down. And above the figure in the white, in careful capital letters that had taken effort, Emily had written, "The Nurse Who Stayed." Nia looked at it for a long time. She thought about Bay 2, about the monitor reading 76/41, about the particular quality of silence that had filled the room after Hale left and before she pressed the emergency button, that moment when the choice was still a choice and not yet an action, when she could have talked herself into compliance and probably survived professionally and lived quietly with the cost of it for the rest of her career. The cost would have been manageable. She had known people who managed it. They went on fine. The work got done. But they carried something she didn't want to carry. And she had understood that in the silence of Bay 2 without having the words for it until now. She had not done that. She looked up at Emily, who was watching her with the patient attention of someone waiting to find out if the gift had landed. "I love it," Nia said. Emily nodded, satisfied, and went back to the living room. Nia looked at Daniel. He was watching her with the same quiet he always wore, not pushing, not filling the space with the weight of the offer. "Tell me what the ethics role actually looks like," she said. He told her. She asked questions, specific ones, the kind that revealed she was already thinking about how it would work, already seeing inside it, already measuring the distance between what it claimed to be and what it could actually become if built right. He answered each one without selling it, in which she appreciated more than a pitch would have offered her. When they finished, she said, "I'll need it in writing, full scope of authority, independent reporting structure, and a clause that says no donor relationship can override a clinical protocol. Those are the terms." "Those were already in the draft," he said. She nodded once. Then she extended her hand, and they shook on it across the kitchen table in the same apartment where she had signed her name as a cooperating witness on a morning when nothing was certain yet. 3 months later, Nia Carter walked into the new facility for the first time as something more than a nurse. She was in scrubs still. She would always be in scrubs. That would never change. But there was a second badge beside the first one now. And what it said represented something she had not had before. The institutional authority to make the decisions that mattered, protected by the structure she had helped build from the ground up. She was standing in the clinical corridor reviewing the intake protocols when the radio crackled at the nurse's station, and the charge nurse looked up and said steadily, "Incoming trauma, pediatric, ETA 4 minutes." The corridor moved. Staff responded. The rhythm of urgency that Nia had lived inside for her entire career picked up around her, and she moved with it, naturally, automatically, toward the bay that would receive the patient. No one was told to wait. No child was told to wait. Nia was in charge. And in this place, in the building she had helped make, no one would be. If you knew the truth and speaking up could cost you everything, would you still do it? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. More stories like this are waiting for you.